Hello, everybody, and welcome to a Sunshine State Digital Network webinar, Introduction to Digital Project Management. Our presenter today is Crystal Thomas. She is the digital archivist at Florida State University and is also a member of our training working group for SSDN. My name is Kayla Zayas-Ruiz. I'm the Sunshine State Digital Network Coordinator, and I will be facilitating any questions in the chat or any technical issues that you might have today during the webinar. Everyone will be muted for the entirety of the webinar, but you are welcome to add questions to the chat if you have any. Please feel free to add questions to the chat at any point during the webinar. Additionally, closed captioning has been enabled for this webinar. So if you would like captioning, just hit the CC button at the bottom of your screen. Additionally, it is also being recorded. So you will get a recording of this session as well as the slides to your email after. We'll also be including a survey in that email, and we would like any feedback that you have about the session or about any additional training that you would like to see from us. And so without further ado, with all of that, I will let Crystal take it away.
Thank you, Kayla. Good afternoon, everyone. As Kayla said, my name is Crystal Thomas. I'm the digital archivist at Florida State University in Special Collections and Archives. I've been in this role since 2012. And under that heading, if you will, I have served as the project manager for the majority of our digitization projects that we've completed here in our digital library center, which is what we call our digital production studio here at FSU Libraries. I have also designed and completed projects around migration onto new digital library platforms. I've done usability testing and documentation review projects. So today's webinar will focus on digital project management, as that is the area I have the most experience in. But we will go over the basics of project management, and those are the same whether you are planning a project to digitize a collection, or a project to set up a new exhibit, or a project to process a collection you have. All those basics pretty much remain the same. Excuse me. Speaking of basics, a good place to start so that we are all on the same page is a definition of project management. This one comes from Jennifer Vinipol, who is a bit of a digital projects guru in our particular field. And she defines project management as the process by which an individual project is organized, overseen, and administered throughout its duration. This particular quote comes from a presentation given at the New York Public Library in 2013, and I will give you a link to all of the slides from it at the end of the presentation. This idea of project management, definition of project management, can be further broken down into 4 stages in a project. So you'll note I said 4 stages, and immediately you see 5 things. There's an explanation. And again, this can work for a digital project or any other project you might be doing. So you'll have the initiation stage, which is where you're formulating the idea for your project. You're putting together stakeholders, you're getting together sort of what will become the project team. Then you go into the planning stage, which is where you are making a very clear plan about what you're about to undertake, and also importantly, what you're not about to undertake. We'll talk about that when we talk about scoping. Then you move into the execution, which is where you're following the plan that you made. Now, often that sort of 4th step, the monitoring and controlling, gets combined with step 3, particularly when you have a smaller organization or a smaller team. It's silly to separate those. There's really not much of a difference. But essentially, with the monitoring and controlling, that's checking in as the project is executed over its timeline. And then the last stage would be the close down. So the completing of the project and all of the steps that might involve. We can break these stages down further into steps. So you'll see that selection, scoping, scheduling, and prepping all fall under that initiation and planning heading. And then you'll have a project briefing and the actual work of the project under execution, along with monitoring and controlling, if you're going to break it down like that. And then under close down, you'll have a project debriefing and a project close down. You'll note there's a lot of time here around initiation and planning, and there's a reason for that. If you read any of the literature in project management, those articles will usually estimate that at least 25% of the time spent on a project as a whole should be spent in the planning stage. I estimate in my work here at FSU, we're actually probably more at 30 to 35%, depending on the project. And if we've seen things like it before, or if this is something entirely new we're about to undertake. The reasons for the long planning stage are that our projects and digitization projects in general are very rarely rinse and repeat. That means that we can usually start with our project templates we have, but almost always each project is going to need special treatment of some kind, which is going to require a little more planning before we start. Also, over time, our projects have become more complex than simply small collections of really easy materials, such as a simple set of photographs or a small set of books. Over time, our projects have started combining formats, so they may have both manuscripts and books and maps. We're also working with more challenging materials where there might be preservation or handling concerns that require an extended period of planning. I say all that knowing that the planning stage is a really difficult stage to stay in. You don't really have anything to show for your work until much later, but it is going to be worth it in the long run for any project you will undertake. It's not necessarily the fun stage. I'm a planner, so I enjoy it, but I've definitely worked with people that hated the planning stage. But what it does is if you spend some time and really get everything sorted in your planning stage, it makes your life so much better in the long run as the project manager. I think this sort of stage is also particularly needed if you're going to use volunteers or people not familiar with digital projects for the work of the project. You want to make sure that you understand and have a really solid plan in place before you get started talking about the project with people who will need a lot of training potentially, or will only participate in one specific task or for a short amount of time. So to summarize that, here at FSU, initiation is part of our planning stage. That's where we do selection and where we spend the majority of our time with any project we undertake, and that it is worth the time to put in when it comes to your planning stage. So now we're going to work our way through each of these steps. Oops, I knew that was going to happen. Reverse, there we go. All right, so selection. Selection can be a complex step in your project. In fact, I have taught whole webinars only on the idea of selection of materials for digitization. So what we're going to do is stick to the basics here. One, you want to make sure you're selecting the right size project for you and your organization. Don't bite off more than you can chew. It would be really wonderful if you could digitize every single photograph in your collection, but that could mean thousands of photographs, and you just might not have the capacity for that right now. You might never have the capacity for that, which leads us to sort of the second really big thing to keep in mind when you're in the selection stage. Managing expectations from internal and external forces around what you can handle right now as you start to prep a project is really important in this stage. Again, yes, it would be great if everything was online, but is that actually necessary or realistic? You know, to return to our photograph example, is every photo actually worth the time and effort for you to digitize it? Can you meaningfully describe every single photo you digitize in a way that makes it worth your time to do the work in the first place? Are all of them so unique as to warrant them all being online? So to get a little into that, I like to point to an example of where selection was not done to illustrate my point. So at one time in the history of FSU, we didn't have a university archives, or at least it was not collected regularly. So when the program was started in the early aunts, every item that came in was very, very precious, and they digitized every single thing that came in. But we didn't know who a lot of those people were. And often what they digitized were just the same photo taken from slightly different angles from the same event over and over and over again. A good example of this is at one point they digitized, they got a collection of photos in from the photo lab on campus. And a lot of what they digitized is just headshots of faculty. So like a faculty person just moving their head around in the same outfit, the same background, everything. And to top it all off, most of the faculty we didn't have names for. So perhaps at that point, they would have been better served with choosing a smaller set of photos to digitize and work with, and to put more of a focus on describing them more usefully, so that people could actually discover and use the materials once they were online in a way that we have found they cannot, essentially, at this point. So that's a good illustration of why selection can be quite important. Moving on from selection, we go to scoping a project, which is a bigger heading again for even smaller steps. You'll notice we just keep adding subtasks to subtasks here. But under scoping, you'll discuss the goals, the deliverables, the tasks, the costs, and the deadlines for projects. So essentially the who, what, where, when, why, how of the project management world. And we're going to go through each of these specifically as well. And we'll start sort of at the top, which is with the goals. You need a big picture. You need the broad scope for the project, and that should really be determined with your staff and any stakeholders to the project. This is setting the goals, right? A tool for this can be a digital project proposal form. You know, what does this project look like to the primary stakeholder? And if you are the primary stakeholder, a form like this can help you clarify what your goals are for this project. So this is a screenshot from a former proposal form that we used to use here at FSU, which is asking the stakeholder, which was often me, to delineate out the exact counts of the types of materials to be included in this project. We eventually retired this form to only internal use, because it was on purpose, I will admit, a bit intense. The reason for that is I wanted people, particularly people outside of the libraries, to realize all of the information you needed to collect before you just started digitizing things. But I will admit it was a bit of a gatekeeping form, which wasn't great. So we have simplified the form that is used by any external stakeholders to bring project ideas to us, essentially. And then we sit down and we talk with them through a scoping process that essentially gets at the information that was originally on that form, but in a much friendlier way. However, either way works. You can ask for all the information up front, or you can get a base idea and sort of build a project out from there. And either direction you go, the things you're really, the information you're looking for is, what does this project look like to both you and the primary stakeholder, if that is someone else? Who is responsible for what parts of the project? And what is the expected final result? Again, a lot of project management is simply managing expectations. And so in being very clear on what an expected final result is, you won't get to the end of a project and people be confused because they thought they were going to get something else out of the project. You want to continually make sure you're all on the same page about what the scope and the result of the project is going to be. Once you have that meeting, that discussion between you and all the stakeholders, and you've got that initial information gathering complete in whatever form that took for you, you can either do a more formal project charter and agreement that everyone sort of signs off on and says, yep, that's what we all agreed on. That's what this project's going to be. You could do these together, or you can do one or the other. All that information and the decisions made on the scope within these discussions can then be transferred to the project briefing document, which should be created regardless of whether there's a formal project charter or not. One note here, and I'll say this a couple of times today, you also want to be clear about what is not in scope. I will often list that out very clearly in project documentation so that no one is confused about what is not being included in the project. Something that I've found that helps with that, if you particularly have a very enthusiastic stakeholder who just keeps bringing you things and is like, let's add this to what you're already doing, just put it with the other boxes, it'll be fine. Is along with the not in scope note in the agreement or the project briefing document, I will put sort of the steps that we could take that if during a project, someone has a great new idea or wants to do more work on something, I will put steps in and be like, okay, if that happens, what do we do? How do we sort of pin that new idea on, off to the side? Don't forget about it. But also don't let it derail the project that it's not a part of the scope in. So that may also help with expectation management if you've got a plan in place for how to deal with scope creep essentially over the course of a project. So once you have that big picture scope and everyone agrees on it, you've got your project charter and or you've got your project briefing document started, that's when you start to work on the specifics. You're scoping out what your exact deliverables will be. And this is when you are listing out the exact materials that are going to be used in this project. So the selection stage gave you the big materials picture, right? Now, as you review that idea, you might remove certain materials or you might determine them to be out of scope for various reasons, such as copyright or preservation concerns, or if the scope has changed and they no longer fit whatever that scope is. You may find in reviewing the collection for specific deliverables that you don't need or want to digitize an entire collection anymore, but just selections from it. This may also be when you evaluate your capacity again to undertake the project, and you could decide, actually, we need to make a smaller selection due to what we can get done now. Or you could also decide at this point to batch the project. So that's when you work on a set of items that's part of the project scope for a certain amount of time. So for the university, we sometimes work in semesters. So we're going to do a batch of material for this project in spring semester. We're going to work on other stuff over summer semester and come back and do the second batch in fall semester. So that could be a way, if you don't have the capacity to take on the whole project at once, how you can start to think about how to batch it in a way that makes it more doable for you. The screenshot here is an example from a project with a community partner here at FSU. So this lists each individual yearbook that was part of the project, has its page count, where the organization it came from, which was important information for when we returned the material to the partner to be able to tell them. But the great thing about this is our metadata librarian was able to repurpose a lot of this information to help complete description for the project. So again, time in the planning stages is well spent for tasks that occur further down the timeline in a project. I have found in project planning, I can reuse almost anything I end up needing to write down at some point. All information is useful. So at this point, the goals and the deliverables, now it's time for tasks, which will also help in the next steps around cost and deadline. Until you know all the tasks that will go into a project, it's hard to estimate costs. How much time is going to be needed? How many people? What kinds of equipment? If you don't know what they're doing, how can you estimate it? It's also hard to estimate deadlines. How do you know how long something's going to take until you know what tasks need to be completed to do that? So this is a screenshot of what we called a project workbook. It was created in a Google Sheets workbook. And each of the project tasks are listed along with any subtasks that may exist, and then a space for notes with each of the tasks as well. Now, this is a project that's only outlined. We hadn't set deadlines at this point or added any more information about the project. I'm going to show you what that looks like in just a few minutes. Essentially, at this point, you should have a really decent idea about the tasks and the workflows the project will need. You can outline them at this point using any project management tool that best fits your needs. And these will be something you solidify later once you have a schedule and you've prepped the collections and you say, yep, this is the list. But outlining them here helps you with the following steps, one of which is scheduling. So at this point in our scope, we've got goals, deliverables, and tasks. So now you can start to create a schedule for that project or the deadlines, right? The schedule will probably, again, just like the tasks, still be slightly nebulous until you do the prepping for the project completely and do the final rundown of those tasks. You can't finalize the schedule for a project, but at this point, you can get a really good idea. What you can do at this point is get the number of hours that the project will take. So in the DLC here at FSU, we're also taking into account what equipment is needed. If that equipment's already been scheduled for other projects, then this new one that we're planning, whether there's certain staffing issues that we need to be aware of and planning around, that sort of thing. But knowing how many hours a project will take is a great place to start. So we take the stages of the project as drafted in the project task list that you just saw, and we use our timing documents to determine hours for each of the different steps in the digitization workflow that we have. So that includes prepping, digitization itself, image processing and quality control of the images, the metadata creation and processing, the loading into our digital library platform, the ingest quality control to make sure everything actually loaded the way we thought it was going to, and then the close down steps. I can look at the DLC schedule, the other commitments faculty and staff may have in the DLC, and then schedule a time frame with dates for the project to be completed at this point, knowing how many hours it will take. How do I figure out the number of hours? So this is a screenshot of our digitization times document that our imaging librarian maintains here at FSU. And this allows me to estimate the digitization time depending on the types of materials to be digitized and the equipment we're going to use to do the work. This is something that took us a long time to figure out, and it is not an exact science, but it definitely helps us get at that number of hours for the scheduling. Metadata creation estimates change, however, depending on who is doing the work. So we have a really simple rule of thumb that we use, and that is that creating one metadata record takes roughly 15 minutes. Now, when someone is starting a new project, they will most likely be slower than that. They're learning the materials, they're getting a handle on what fields are needed in that particular case, but they're going to get a lot faster over the course of the project. And lots of copying and pasting will help them get faster too. So a 15-minute estimate per item usually gives us a rough general ballpark for the total amount of time it will take to describe a project. Now, these estimates are reviewed and updated as needed. We try and do it at least on a yearly basis or when new equipment comes in. Anyone internally can see these documents, and we want them to be able to do so that particularly our internal stakeholders can see how time for a project has a clear basis on how we arrived to it. We didn't just pull estimates out of thin air. There was a lot of thought put into figuring out how long a project would take. So once you know the deliverables, how much stuff you've got, the tasks, what needs to be done, and the schedule, how long it's going to take, from there you can figure out the labor, equipment, and any supply costs that a project will have. I recommend using the DLF digitization cost calculator. It's a really great resource for helping with this. And they also review the data that is used in the calculator at regular intervals. So it remains a current tool. It's not out of date in any way. Also, even if you are thinking you want to use a vendor for your project ultimately, this will help you understand the sort of quote you might get back from a vendor. And it also makes you think through all the questions a vendor is probably going to ask you in trying to get a quote. So it has a dual purpose there. And then finally, we have made it to prepping. And what you're going to do at this stage, which is right before we have the project briefing, is you want to co-locate everything that you have created, discovered, and documented in all of the different tasks of the planning stage. And you're going to co-locate that into your project briefing document, which we're going to look at a little closer here in a moment. But also, it's really nice to have a sort of what I call one-stop shop for any project that you're doing. So having all of your documentation in a single directory, so a folder that's holding the project briefing document and any other documentation you may have created so far, having that in a common location is going to make everyone's lives easier throughout the course of the project. And when I say common location, I mean in a place everyone on the project can access. This isn't siloed onto a single person's machine. Everyone should have access to it. Also, at this point, you're going to finalize that project task list in whatever project management tool you're using. You're going to finalize that timeline. You're going to put that into the task list, and you're going to take into account any changes that may have occurred since you first drafted that timeline. A few things may have shifted. And then you're also going to prep the physical collections themselves for the project. And that might mean movement of the collection between spaces. It might mean marking objects that are going to be omitted from the digitization project so that they're clearly visible to the folks doing the digitization to know to skip something. So that's what I mean when I say prep of the physical collection. And then here, as promised, is a screenshot of a more complete project workbook. We saw the beginnings of it earlier. So this has outlined all the tasks. It has added in the due date for the task so that the folks responsible for it know when it should be completed. And we've also added any relevant notes to each task and if there's anything special about how it needs to be completed. You'll note we also track the actual start and completion dates. This allows us over time to have a better idea of when projects go right or wrong. And we can have a discussion about why those dates were different than what were originally planned. So full disclosure, I will admit here at FSU, we don't use the spreadsheet anymore, but I like to still share it as it's a tool that everyone is probably familiar with a spreadsheet, right? And are comfortable using spreadsheets. So it's a great starting place if you've never done a project like this before. For us in the Digital Library Center here, we list and track this work now in an online project management tool called FreeCamp. And what that does is it allows us not only to see this project, so this single project and all of its tasks and what's been done, but we can see all of our projects and their work, which helps us to get a better idea of our overall portfolio of projects. Basically, we kind of outgrew the spreadsheet, but it's also a great tool, so I still like to share it. So before we launch into starting the work, we have a project briefing. And this is when you get the project team, everyone who's going to work on this project, and potentially all external and internal stakeholders who might be not doing the actual work of the project, but have a stake in it, into a room together, physically or on Zoom, and go over what you're actually about to start doing. And you're going to review the following together so that everyone's on the same page and no one is confused or under a false impression about what the project is going to accomplish. Remember, managing expectations here. So in a project briefing document, I always have a project overview. So the big picture, why are we doing this project? You know, it's important not to lose sight of that when you're in the minutia of a project to know why you're doing it. The scope, what's in scope and what is out of scope, what the major deliverables are going to be. I always list possible issues and concerns with a project. And basically what I put here is sort of what's the weird stuff people are going to encounter during the project and not know what to do with. Some of that's really basic. So with certain projects, I will note here, it is okay to remove staples during the course of digitization. For some collections, we don't want to do that for whatever reason. And I need to make sure they know, okay, in this project, don't remove staples. And this is how we're going to handle that. So that's the sort of thing I put under the issues and concerns section in a project briefing. We go over the timeline. We make sure everyone is aware of what the timeline is and that they agree with it. Does anyone see any big problems that somehow you've missed at this point that need to be taken care of? And then the last thing I outline is the communication path for the project. How are we going to talk about this project while it's ongoing? How are we going to keep people informed about its progress over the course of it? Making sure everyone's clear about where to go to get information about the project. Having all of this information in a project briefing document, so a single Word document, also means that as people come and go from the project, you have a document that you can send people to in order to get them very quickly on the same page with the project and what its planned deliverables are, without having to go through big, long discussions about why you made the decisions you made. It's all in a single document. So this is a screenshot of part of a page from a project briefing document for a project we did several years ago now. And you'll see this is outlining the project. It's making sure everyone knows why we're doing it, which again, I can't emphasize enough. It makes people working on the project feel invested and gives them a broader knowledge of why we do what we do. Because digitization isn't the most exciting thing you can ask people to do on a regular basis. So letting them know that there's this bigger picture and this really neat reason usually why we're doing something helps them feel like their work is very meaningful. And then the other thing I always will include in project briefing documents are any links to useful or supplemental information. Again, so that there's a single document that they can kind of go off of in all directions as needed throughout the project. And we finally made it. We have reached the execution, monitoring, and controlling stages of the project. So this is where the work of the project commences. And if planned correctly, each person knows what they need to be doing and when they need to have it done by. For us in the DLC, that means digital imaging, metadata creation, quality control of both images and metadata, ingest into our digital library platform, the quality control check of material after it has been ingested. That is all the work of a project. For us and really for any project, communication should be occurring throughout via updates at meetings or through various communication channels that may be in use for you and your project team. And also inevitably during this particular stage, there will be troubleshooting. Because no matter how beautifully you plan your project, things will happen almost the second a project starts. And that's okay. Your plan wasn't set in stone as much as you had hoped it would be. It wasn't. And it's flexible. It should be flexible. And luckily, actually, because you have your plan and you really thought hard and long and you went through all of the stages for planning, troubleshooting along the way shouldn't derail it. But will actually allow you to probably streamline that plan more as you move forward because potentially you just didn't think of something. And once you encounter it the first time, you'd be like, okay, we know how to handle that now. Let's document that in our project briefing document, or a lot of people may maintain a project changes document so that everyone now knows this is how we do that thing for the rest of the project, and you won't encounter that problem again. So it's not a bad thing when something goes a little awry in a project. It's an opportunity to make the project better over the long term. So after you've completed the work of the project, yay, now is the time to pause and reflect. And you do this at a project debriefing meeting, which is where you get all the stakeholders together again. So it should be the same people who are at the project briefing meeting, if possible. Understanding people will come and go potentially. During a project debriefing, the following questions are asked and then documented, and you save that in a document with the rest of your project documentation for future reference. So I asked three main questions, sort of the challenges. What didn't go as planned in this project and why? And then talk about what worked really well for the project. Why do we think it worked that well? And then third, and probably most importantly, what can we do better next time? How do we fix any of the problems that occurred? How can we take what we learned and use it for the next project? Or potentially, how do we take what we learned and update our overall workflows in general so that every project following will benefit from what we learned here? Now, this is a screenshot from a very old project now. You can see it's from 2015, but it's a project that really spectacularly blew up. Everything that could go wrong went wrong. And it's one of the reasons that we have the majority of the project workflows that we have now in the DLC. This project pretty much directly resulted in a lot of the workflows that we still use today. And I share this because it can be really hard to talk about where you messed up, but it is incredibly vital to do so in order that you don't keep having the same problems over and over again. So a project debriefing is a really great time to ask your team or the people who did the work of the project to be very candid with you and to be like, if you could have done it different, what would you have done? Or this constantly broke and didn't work. Why was that? And again, it can be an uncomfortable space potentially, but it is worth it to try and make sure that it doesn't happen again and that you aren't constantly having a project with the exact same issues over and over again. And then lastly, we get to closing out a project. The things that we do here is one, again, all that documentation that you've created throughout the course of this whole project is placed in its final form to wherever you store your documents long term. Again, I will stress this should be a central location accessible to everyone, not just to one person. That is your win the lottery principle for the day. If I win the lottery tomorrow, chances are I'm not coming to work. But all of my documentation, all of the planning, all the projects that I'm in charge of, all that documentation is somewhere that everyone else who works here could get to it if they needed to, so that work won't derail because I am no longer a part of the process. Also in this documentation, we do archive all of our project tasks and notes that were included with it. And we also, in this work, create a credits list where we list everyone who worked on the project. And the reason we do that, and we also consolidate pretty much everything that we documented throughout the course of the project, is we share all of our project documentation through our digital library so that our processes and decisions are transparent. And the credits list is to really give credit where credit's due. There is a lot of invisible labor when it comes to digitization projects in particular. And with our student workers, especially if they're going into this field, I want them to be able to point to a collection and say, like, look, there's my name. I did this work for this collection, and you can see what I did. But also, it's just important to acknowledge this work that often goes very much unnoticed until it doesn't work. And then the other part of closing out a project is outreach and next steps in some ways. So you want to tell people that you finished. You want to encourage people to go use this material that you've just put online. We use our blog to do that the most often here with DLC projects. And the other part of this work for us is we want to make sure, if needed, that both the library catalog and archive space, which is our finding aid database for our manuscript collections, get updated with links to the new digitized materials as well to make sure they're as discoverable as possible in all the places a user might look for them. To shift gears just a smidge and talk for a minute about project management tools. As you noticed from most of the examples I used today, spreadsheets are your friends. They are simple. Everyone can use them for the most part, and you don't need something more complex, particularly if you're starting out in this work. And again, there's my other reminder again to make sure they are located in a place everyone can see them. And then I do list some free options for both project management tools and communication tools. There are a ton more. If you run a Google search for free project management software or free team communication options, you're going to get a lot of results. My note there for you is to remember that project management needs for an institution are very unique for all of us. You may need to be willing to try a few different solutions before you find the one that fits. And don't be afraid, again, to say, this isn't working. This tool isn't working for us. And have a conversation with you and your team and be like, why isn't it working? And what could fix the problem? What actions or functions would help? Sometimes the fancy software cannot do for you what a spreadsheet can, depending on your team and the way that you manage projects. It took us a long time here at FSU and the DLC to find project management software that people would use, essentially. Because sometimes project management software can cause more problems than it's worth. Some just have too many bells and whistles, and people don't know where to go to find the information because there's so much going on. A lot of the time, you don't get enough buy-in from staff to use them, so they just don't get used at all. And you may find tools that have like 3 things you need, but it's missing the 4th thing. And at that point, you're like, do we go find a new tool, or do we figure out how to use this tool and not worry about the thing that it's missing? Good rule of thumb when it comes to project management tools is KISS. If in confused or doubt, so keep it simple, stupid. Go back to the basics. If the fancy project management software you really wanted to use is just not getting used in a way that's making your lives better, because your project management tool should make your life easier, not harder. Life's hard enough as a project manager. And then last thing for you all are some resources for digital project management to take a look at. These may be useful to consult as you get started. The Library of Congress has very extensive, it's an older website, but still has lots of good information on digital project planning and management. There's the link to the Vinipol presentation I mentioned at the start of the presentation. There is the Digital Library Federation, or DLF, has a crowdsourced digital project management toolkit that's hosted on their wiki, that's updated regularly. And then there is UCLA Special Collections Digital Project Toolkit, which actually has a lot, if I recall correctly, of like samples of forms or different templates to use for digital project management. So that might be a good place to start if you don't know quite where to start. But it is, again, if I recall, very predicated on how UCLA does their work. So it might not fit the needs of your organization. And then one last thing, all of the screenshots, all the different documents that I mentioned that we've used here at FSU over the years, I do have samples and templates in a shared folder on Google Drive, which you can get to at this link. That also includes a lot of other documents I use for other presentations over time, but you'll find in there a digital collections development policy, digital imaging standards, metadata standards, that digitization times estimate that you saw in a snapshot. There is an actual copy of it there for you. So there's lots of stuff in there that didn't necessarily get mentioned today, but may be of use if you're new to digitization projects in general. And that is what I have for you today. Thank you so much. I don't know what PowerPoint's doing, but I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you so much, Crystal. Additionally, Crystal and I wrote a review for FreeCamp a couple years ago for the SFA journal. I put a link in there for anyone who's interested in getting a more in-depth view of how we use that here. If anyone's interested in that. If anyone has any questions, please feel free to put those in the chat now. And again, you will be getting a copy of these slides, so you'll have all those links and resources, and you'll get a recording as well. Is anyone working on a project and they have a specific question that they want to ask about? That they're stuck with something?
It was very thorough, apparently.
People agree. I am gonna stop the recording.